This video aims to explain an element of moral reasoning that I wish to illustrate by looking at the question in the abortion debate, what is a person? We divide the world into things that have rights, towards which we have moral obligations, and things without rights, which we may justifiably treat as mere things. At what point does a conceptus make this transition from a mere thing to something with rights and towards which we have obligations? Philosophers have a practice called conceptual analysis, where we look at the common use of a term to try to figure out what the term is used to talk about, if anything. On the question of what counts as a person, the goal is to determine what it is that distinguishes persons from non-persons. The concept of a person isn't just used in the abortion debate. A successful conceptual analysis of person would be applicable to all cases where we may question whether something may be treated as a thing or as something with rights. For example, do animals possess the characteristics required to have the moral status of personhood? Some argue that the only thing one needs to have is the capacity to suffer. Animals certainly have that. Others hold that it requires some more complex forms of cognition. Another application that's becoming more and more relevant concerns the possibility of creating artificial intelligence that has rights. Under what conditions might it be a moral crime comparable to murder to turn off a computer and erase the hard drive? Under what circumstances might extraterrestrial life have a moral status of personhood? There's a quote from the movie Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country, in which a Klingon, being lectured on human rights, sneers, "Human rights, the very name is racist." I can imagine somebody protesting that we can't bring up artificial intelligence and extraterrestrial life until these are real. Otherwise, our talk is just make-believe science fiction. But that's not true. We have to be able to evaluate an act as right or wrong before we perform it. Otherwise, we couldn't judge an act as wrong until we've already done it, and then it's too late. Another area where the application of personhood is relevant is concerning the effects of mental illness on personhood. If having certain cognitive capacities determines whether one has rights, then does a mental illness that deprives one of those capacities mean that one is just an object? Conceptual analysis usually, though not always, involves a search for necessary and sufficient conditions. So what is necessary to be a person? What is sufficient? What's the difference? Let me explain with this example. In order to be President of the United States, you have to be at least 35 years old. This is a necessary condition. If you're not at least 35 years old, you can't be president. But it's not sufficient. There are a lot of people 35 years old and older who are not president of the United States. So something else is required, such as having won the election. A necessary condition for being president or for being a person means that you can't be that thing without this necessary condition being true. A sufficient condition means that it's enough, though perhaps there are other ways to get the same result. You can have pizza for supper if you have one delivered, or if you cook it yourself. Either one is sufficient. Neither one is necessary. Now, another general principle that we will need to pay attention to is that of supervenience. One property supervenes on another in virtue of the fact that if one property changes, the other property has to change as well. Being a person is a moral property. However, there's an argument that holds that moral properties supervene on physical properties. So, for example, take two identical beings, identical twins. It would make no sense to say that one of them is a person and the other isn't. In order for it to be the case that one entity is a person and the other isn't, it must be something about them that's responsible for the difference. Our task is to find out what it is. Our first question is being human a necessary condition for being a person? We would test this by asking whether it's possible to conceive of a being that is not human, but still a person, still something that has moral rights. If one can think that Vulcans from Star Trek, or Wookiees from Star Wars, or hobbits from The Lord of the Rings have a moral status, then it can't be the case that being a human is a necessary condition for having moral status. These species are not human, but they have moral status. If being human isn't necessary, then we can't rule out animals, extraterrestrials, or artificial intelligence on the grounds that they are not human. So is being human a sufficient condition for being a person? Is it enough? Many people believe that it is. In virtue of the fact that we have a distinct human being, we have a person, and it is the holder of certain rights, such as a right to life. Somebody might object that being human is not sufficient. In addition to being human, one has to be conceived in a particular way. If one is conceived as a result of rape or incest, then one is not a person and has no right to life to be protected. Only those conceived as a result of sex among consenting adults has rights. But then people who are adults conceived through incest and rape are persons with rights. So this suggests that one's having a right does not depend on how one is conceived. There is no moral reason to treat those conceived by rape or incest any different from any other person. But there's a problem with using species membership as a criteria for personhood. One's status as a moral being is then independent of facts about oneself as an individual. Imagine, as a result of a natural genetic mutation or a mad philosopher scientist genetic engineering, an intelligent hamster? A scientist engineers two intelligent hamsters. If moral status depends on species membership, then what are we to say about our intelligent hamsters? Do they lack personhood since they belong to a species that generally lacks personhood, or do all other members of the species acquire personhood because these two hamsters now exist? It seems somewhat odd that the regular hamster over there has one moral status yesterday and a different moral status today simply because our intelligent hamsters came into existence last night. Somebody might say that this is not odd because animals have rights. They meet the criteria of personhood. Here we have to be careful. We're asking whether something has the full rights of personhood. What would it mean to say that hamsters are persons? It would seem to imply that if humans have a right to have enough to eat, basic medical care, and a minimum quality of life, then so do animals, or at least those animals that meet the criteria of personhood. It would seem to imply that a predator species such as tigers, falcons, and sharks should be treated like compulsively violent humans and locked up where they can't do any harm until they can be cured. Denying personhood to animals does not imply denying them a moral status. There are options between having no rights and having all the rights of personhood. One of the things we need to determine in our investigation into personhood is if animals have the full rights of personhood or something different, or no rights at all. On the other hand, when talking about humans, it's problematic to talk about some humans having more rights than others in virtue of their intelligence or reasoning ability or some other factor. We tend to think of all humans having the same rights regardless of their individual differences. You either have rights or you don't have rights. Is it the same for animals? If species membership doesn't work for personhood, what about individual characteristics? We might say that our individual hamsters are full persons because of what is true about them, their ability to reason. It doesn't depend on their species. Now, the question becomes, what characteristics does an individual need to have personhood? In the case of a human, we're talking about a collection of atoms that consists of a separate sperm and egg, and another collection of atoms 20 years later that's a college student. At what point did that entity make the transition from non-person to person? This transition is fairly significant. This suggests that we should be looking at a point of significant change as the point at which personhood is acquired. One point of significant change is birth. So, is birth the event that allows one to make a transition from non-person to person? If this is the case, then a woman who's pregnant, in labor, in the hospital, moments away from giving birth, would have the right to say, I don't want this baby, kill it. Kill it before it's born. It seems odd that mere location would be a criteria for personhood. If you take an entity and put it in one location, then it has rights and can't be treated in certain ways. Move it to a different location, and it has no rights, and one may do whatever one wants without wronging that entity. Besides, if a fetus before birth has no moral value, then not only would the mother be morally permitted to kill it, the mother would be morally permitted to gouge out its eyes or have a limb removed or make any other alteration less dramatic than killing. So then, we could say that personhood is acquired on conception, except almost every form of life, down to the mosquito and sea anemone, has more functionality than a freshly fertilized egg. Conception may give the egg more properties than it had, but the qualities provided don't seem to be those that are required for personhood. If they were, then a clam could be a person. A potential response to this says that it's not the existing functionality that matters, but future functionality. The fetus has a potential that a clam doesn't have, and that's what gives it personhood. Well, some fetuses. There are some children who are born with mental defects that prevent them from ever being able to even feed themselves. Assuming that the mentally deficient individual doesn't have the potential to think or act that even a clam has, then is it not a person? Can we eat it? On the other side of the debate, if somebody thinks that not having this functionality means that the fetus is not a person, then does an adult that loses the functionality as a result of mental illness or age lose their personhood? Can we kill the individual without worrying about all of the messy moral matters such as consent or respect? We have looked at questions of species membership and individual qualities as qualities necessary or sufficient for personhood. There are theories that hold that personhood depends on certain relational properties. Let's look back at the conception theory of personhood for a moment. One thesis is that the potential to become a person is what makes one a person. If left alone to develop, the fetus will acquire the faculties of personhood. So that makes it a person. That gives it rights. We've already seen that this is sometimes false. Some fetuses don't have this potential, but most do, almost all do. But the claim that the fetus will acquire these properties of personhood if left alone is clearly false, and the fact that it's false is a major source of the problem. If left alone, the fetus will die. Put a conceptus in space, and it has zero potential of acquiring intelligence or reason or other properties often associated with personhood. This requires outside intervention. But then, other animals might have the same potential with the right intervention. Do animals have a right to demand this intervention from others so that they can become rational beings, so that they can become a person, in fact? Another relationship that people often refer to, this one to deny personhood, is the fact that the fetus depends on the mother for its survival. To a certain extent, though, we are all dependent on others for our survival, so we can see right away that if independence is a necessary condition for personhood, then it must be a special kind of independence, such as basic biological ability to survive independent of another. Against this thesis, the Star Trek franchise has a species called the Trill. The Trill have a relationship with another intelligent species, a symbiotic species that can only exist within a host Trill. Within the Star Trek universe, Trill consider it an honor to host a symbiote, and there are more than enough Trill volunteering for the relationship. What is relevant here is the status of the symbiote species as persons. Does the fact that the symbiote is dependent on another for its survival imply that it's not a person, that it is not a legitimate object of moral obligations? Imagine a Trill undergoing the transplant process for the pure pleasure of it, because let us assume it's enjoyable. And then after the process is done and the symbiote is implanted, saying, "I don't want this thing inside of me, kill it." A case could be made that it would be immoral for a Trill to undergo the implantation process unless the Trill is willing to accept the consequences of being bonded with the symbiote. If one doesn't want to accept the responsibilities involved in having a symbiote implanted, one shouldn't go through the procedure, even if it's pleasurable. If one doesn't wish to accept the responsibilities involved in having a fetus implanted, one shouldn't go through the procedure, even if it's pleasurable. Now, this argument would allow for exceptions due to rape and in cases where a minor becomes pregnant or any similar case in which the woman is incapable of giving informed consent to the procedure or to having sex. Such a burden shouldn't be placed on a person without their consent, we could argue. However, consent here is inferred from agreeing to the procedure, or, in the case of the analogy, by agreeing to have sex. As an alternative, let's imagine an infectious disease, COVID-214b, that has the effect of shutting down the human body for 9 months, completely. Even the brain ceases to function. And the only way to keep somebody alive is to hook them up to somebody else willing to provide life support. Their kidneys filter the blood, their breathing oxygenates the blood, and their immune system protects the individual from disease. Let us again assume that the procedure to hook somebody up is quite pleasurable, tickling the pleasure centers of the brain. Is it morally permissible to undergo the procedure to experience the pleasure, then unhook oneself and have the individual die as a result? In other words, does the fact that one is dependent on another for their biological survival mean that one is not a person and is not a legitimate object of moral obligation? Still, let's not ignore the fact that the symbiote and the victim of COVID-214b have been fully functioning persons at some time. This is not true of the fetus. It still begins as an entity having less functionality than a jellyfish. The fact that it can acquire properties that are considered relevant for personhood doesn't imply that it has those properties any more than the fact that a bucket can hold 5 gallons of water implies that it is now holding 5 gallons of water. That inference is invalid. So what is the main lesson to be drawn from this video? Mostly I'm using it to illustrate arguments concerning the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a certain kind of thing, in this case for being a person. A particular property is necessary for being a kind of thing, such as a person, if it is not possible to conceive of something being that kind of thing if it lacks this property. A property is sufficient for being a kind of thing if having the property guarantees that it's that kind of thing. If you're still confused about the distinction, then note that the order for being a kind of thing and having a property is reversed in these two cases. For a necessary condition, being a kind of thing requires having the property. For a sufficient condition, having the property guarantees that one is that kind of thing. The necessary and sufficient conditions for personhood are still up for debate. The fact that this debate is still up in the air invites another question. How should you treat something if you don't know whether it's a person, if you haven't been able to show that it has or lacks a moral standing? Should you assume that it has no moral standing and may be treated as a mere thing until moral standing is proved? Or should you give it the benefit of the doubt and treat it as a person unless and until sufficient evidence and good enough argument proves that it is not? We should recall that in history, other people are often not assumed to be persons, particularly if they were of a particular race, or gender, or stage of cultural development, or education. However, I also want to note that in a separate video discussing the basic arguments on the legitimacy of abortion, I assumed that the fetus was a person. Even if this is granted, one may argue, there are things one person may not do to another without their consent. And this makes no sense if it doesn't imply that one has a right to deny consent.